Imagine yourself in a lab. The space looks like a quintessential science lab with test tubes, pipes, valves, and all kinds of science equipment all over the place. A researcher is focused on a glass flask. The bottom part is like a glass ball, and on top are 3 openings that look a little bit like short test tubes. To me, it kind of looks like a hand holding up 3 fingers. This is what he's using to create billions of nanoparticles. He attaches a tube to one of the flask's openings and plugs up another with a stopper. How small are these nanoparticles?
If you imagine a speck of dust, the nanoparticles, they're about 1,000 times smaller than the speck of dust.
Husband and wife Ole and Olena Teratula are in charge of this whole operation. Ole is a professor at the Oregon State University College of Pharmacy. He and his team are focused on developing new treatments for diseases like ovarian cancer and endometriosis.
In this case, we use these special nanoparticles based on iron oxide, and those nanoparticles, they are magnetic.
I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. As you can probably tell, I'm not in the Gert Boyle studio today, though today is Gert Boyle's birthday. So happy birthday, Gert. This episode of The Evergreen is being recorded in front of a live audience at the Tomorrow Theater in Portland. And joining me right now is OPB science reporter Jess Burns, who is also the host and producer behind the All Science No Fiction video series. Hi. And Jess, you recently visited Ole and Olena Teratula's lab to learn more about this fascinating research that is happening there. So let's get into it. What exactly are they trying to do with these magnetic nanoparticles?
Well, they're developing a treatment designed to kill cancer. And they're doing this by essentially trying to cook the tumors inside of your body. It's mind-blowing. It's crazy. It's amazing. But they're doing this without cooking the rest of your body, because that would be really important, not to cook the rest of it. So what they're doing is a technique. It's called magnetic hyperthermia. And the key word here is hyperthermia. That's the opposite of hypothermia, right? If you go outside, you get too cold, you get hypothermia. This is when your cells get too hot. So the way it works, a lab is making a special kind of nanoparticle, super tiny atomic structures made of iron and cobalt, which are magnetic. And the part of this science that feels a little bit like magic still to me, and I've seen it in action and it still feels a little bit like magic, is that if you expose those particles to an alternating magnetic field, they heat up. And if those nanoparticles are around a cancer cell or inside of a cancer cell, they heat up hot enough to kill that cell.
Wow. So why are the Teratulas and their team focused on treating ovarian cancer specifically?
Well, ovarian cancer is a tricky disease. I don't know how much you know about it. One of the real challenges with it is when you have it, the symptoms that present can be like 10 different other much more likely and much more benign, reproductive health issues. And so, I was talking to a friend of mine who works in the healthcare field, and she said that her biggest fear is that she will miss a diagnosis of ovarian cancer because it could be that, but to diagnose it is just really difficult. And so the consequence of not catching it, of course, is that if it's there for a long time untreated, it can metastasize, it can spread. And that's a problem because once cancer spreads, your chances of surviving it are much lower. And I looked up the stats on this, and it's really tough. It's the 5-year survival rate is like 50%. And that's, in part, that's because it's so difficult to diagnose and it's so difficult to catch right at the very beginning. And I think that this is kind of what's so hopeful about the work that this lab is doing, and seeing that firsthand, seeing these scientists at work. Ole basically said he's up for the challenge.
I always want to treat diseases, complicated diseases, and at the same time, I also wanted to pay attention to diseases which don't have a good treatment at this point in time.
I'm so glad to know that a disease like this is getting this kind of attention. And they're actually creating these nanoparticles in a lab. How do they do that?
So, working in this lab is someone in my head. I kind of refer to him as the nanoparticle chef. He's in there. His name is Prem Singh, and he's in the audience right now. He's a postdoc, and he specializes in making these tiny particles. And so basically, he creates new recipes, he tinkers, he innovates, he kind of plays around with raw ingredients and the different processes. And he cooks them up in that fancy ball test tube with the fingers that you were talking about earlier. And instead of tasting the results, though, like a chef would, I don't know if you could taste these or not. You probably, I would say, let's not do that.
That's additional research required.
Yeah. Because they're so small, to figure out if he's made something good, he'd have to look under a electron microscope. And then they would do tests to test whether, they heat up the way that they want to. And so, he's got to do all of this work, and I'm going to carry the metaphor through to see if his nanoparticles are James Beard worthy, right? So this is how Prem explains his approach.
The atoms start coming together and form nuclei, and then the nucleation process starts, and after that, it grows into nanoparticles. So this is a bottom-up approach.
So I know that it's important for these nanoparticles to have like a uniform shape and size, right? Why is that important?
Well, the shape and the size determine for nanoparticles determine the properties of the nanoparticles. And nanoparticles are used to do all sorts of things. This lab is specialized looking at them for medical treatments, but they're used in products, they're used in all of the things. They're pretty ubiquitous being used right now. But it's important for them because, if you are going to be injecting something into your body, you want to make sure that they are all the thing that you want to inject, right? So it's really important. That's another reason why it's important for them to be. Here's how Ole put it.
We prepared the nanoparticles which has the shape as a hexagon. And obviously, the change in the shape increased the magnetic property, and as a result, we were able to increase the heating efficiency.
Ole Teratula said he was inspired by some similar research that's going on in Europe, where the nanoparticles are injected directly into a cancer tumor. But that would only work if the tumor could be reached for an injection, which is fairly invasive. And it wouldn't work for late-stage ovarian cancer that has already metastasized and spread to other parts of the body. Ole's team is working on a less invasive method where nanoparticles could be injected into the bloodstream and basically target the cancer cells through the veins that grow on the tumors themselves.
When you inject nanoparticles systemically, only a certain percentage of the injected dose can end up in the cancer tumor. So let's say we're talking about 3-4%.
This is why heating efficiency is so important. If there are fewer nanoparticles to do the job of cooking the cancer cells than there would be if they were injected directly, those nanoparticles need to be able to generate enough heat to be effective. So Jess, how do they actually heat up these nanoparticles once they accumulate in the cancer cells?
All right, so the way that I visualize it. And the way that kind of the real world example that makes the most sense to me is an induction stovetop. Are you familiar with this? Yeah. Okay. So if people listening aren't, so what this is, it's a stovetop. And when you turn on a burner, it doesn't actually get hot. Like you can put your hand on the burner and there's no heat there. Instead, what this does is it creates a magnetic field, and the magnetic field causes the metal in your pan to heat up. And it has to be a ferrous metal for it to heat up. So it has to be magnetic. So that's why like an aluminum pan is not going to heat up on an induction stove top. So to be clear though, what they're doing is not induction. They're tapping into another process or several other processes. One of them is called hysteresis. But your experience of this is very similar to what you would get with an induction stovetop. So to kill a human cell, though, you only need to get the cell up to a temperature of about like 108, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But as you mentioned earlier, the lab's nanoparticles have to get hotter than that to do the job, right? So I think about it as like a cup of water, right? And you have a cup of water and you want to raise the temperature of that water with a few hot pebbles, right? The pebbles that you put in the water have to be a lot hotter because they're so small in order to get the water temperature up to the place where you want it. So that's part of it. The other kind of cool thing that the lab is doing is they're developing a way to apply the alternating magnetic field in a really targeted way. Because for this, the nanoparticles respond when they're affected by it. So if you're injecting them systemically, you don't want the ones that are kind of flowing in your blood over here to heat up, right? You want to make sure that you're targeting it. So they've developed this, what they call a pancake coil. And it's a great term. It's this round kind of like flapjack looking paddle on a bendy arm. And what they can do is say you're treating ovarian cancer, they'd give you the injection, the particles accumulate, and then you put the paddle like right on your stomach, like lower stomach. And so it's super, super targeted. And through this, they can, the hope is they'll eventually be able to really efficiently knock back ovarian cancer. And in tests so far, they say they've been able to impede the growth by 7 times over time. So yeah, so it's coming along.
Yeah, that is really cool and magical, like you say. Well, thank you for breaking some of that down for us. Coming up after a break, we are going to hear more about some other applications for magnetic nanoparticles. And we'll hear from the cinematographer and editor who worked with Jess on her reporting and has a personal connection to the subject at hand. Thanks for listening to The Evergreen, our podcast from OPB about the place you call home. If you dig what you hear, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app, and we'll brighten your Monday morning a little bit with something new and exciting to listen to each week. You can also follow me on Instagram at Jen Chavez OPB, that's Jen with 2 N's, and I will keep you posted on what Team Evergreen is up to. And remember, this episode about the medical applications of magnetic nanoparticles and all the great OPB reporting and storytelling you hear on this show is made possible by the support of many thousands of OPB members. That's the beauty of public media, my friends. Support our journalism by becoming an OPB sustaining member today at opb.org/pod. And now, back to our show at the Tomorrow Theater. OPB science reporter Jess Burns is still here, and joining us is Brooke Herbert. Brooke is a Yes! Round of applause for Brooke. We do love Brooke. Brooke is a cinematographer and editor at OPB, and she filmed the interviews and all the footage Jess used for her reporting on nanoparticles and the scientists' work in their lab at Oregon Health and Science University. Hello, Brooke.
Hi, Jen. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So, we just talked a lot about how this treatment would work, and we mostly focused on cancer treatments. But one of the other applications the scientists are exploring is treating endometriosis. And Brooke, I understand this is something that you have personal experience with, right?
Yes, you are right. So a couple of years ago, I was also diagnosed with endometriosis. So when Jess approached me at OPB and asked if I would do this project with her, I was super excited to do it.
Well, I'm so glad that you guys got together and created this wonderful story. For anyone who doesn't know, will you just explain a little bit about what endometriosis is?
Yes, I will try. It's a very complicated disease, but with endometriosis, what happens is normally in the uterus, there's a tissue and there's a lining that forms in the uterus and then is shed every month. So with endometriosis, what happens is tissue that's really, really similar to that lining starts to grow in other places that it shouldn't be growing. So some of that tissue will start to form in your fallopian tubes. It might form on your ovaries. It can form on the outside of your uterus. And then in some cases, it also will start to form tissue on other organs in your body. So when that happens, you can imagine like all this tissue that's not supposed to be growing starts to build up and create implants. It can create lesions. And then eventually, over the years as it's building, it creates like a scar tissue. And then kind of what happens as a result of that is people who have endometriosis will experience a lot of pain, or often they'll experience like a lot of pain with this. And then eventually, as more scar tissue kind of grows and there's more inflammation, it can also cause infertility in some people. And the thing about endometriosis is that they don't really know what causes it. I mean, scientists, are doing all kinds of advancements all the time. So a lot of scientists are trying to figure out what causes it, but ultimately they don't really know, and there's not really any good treatment, and there's no cure for it.
And even though it's really common, like I know a lot of people who struggle with endometriosis, 1 in 10 women has endometriosis. In spite of that, it's often difficult to get a diagnosis. Was that your experience as well?
Yes, so you're right. It's 1 in 10 women have endometriosis, and it often takes close to or as like long as a decade to get diagnosed.
Wow.
So yeah, so you can imagine like what that means, So my experience was pretty common just from talking to other women and doing reporting on this. So what happens often is you start having these, symptoms. So for me, like in my late teens and early 20s, I started to experience a lot of pain. But the first thing that happens is like I dismissed it myself. So, you dismiss your own pain. You're like, it's not that bad. So I kind of ignored it for a while. And then around like my mid 20s, I was like, like I was having a gut feeling like something was off. So experiencing like a lot more pain. So, and pain that was like, when we talk about like maybe having like a headache, this isn't like having a headache that you just can pop a couple ibuprofen, it's like a really like life-changing kind of pain. So I finally did go see a doctor and was, really dismissed. I kind of explained my symptoms, and as I think happens to a lot of people, she just, suggested I take ibuprofen. They often will recommend that you start like a hormonal birth control. So she kind of dismissed me, and I really like left that doctor appointment feeling kind of defeated, and I felt actually like really embarrassed, like I was being overly dramatic. And I think that's a lot of people's experience. So it took me several more years to kind of get the courage to go back to another doctor. And I went through a couple more doctors until I finally found one here in Portland who actually diagnosed, the endometriosis. So that time frame was over a decade in my case. And I think that's very, that's what a lot of people experience.
Well, I'm glad you got the diagnosis, but I'm sorry you had to go through all of that and deal with pain for so long. Thank you for sharing a little bit about your experience. Just the Taratulas and their team are hoping that the nanotechnology they're developing could help with diagnosing and treating endometriosis. How would that work?
Well, the treating part is the same that I described for, essentially the same that I described for the cancer, right?
Right.
Instead of cooking tumor cells, aim would be to kill the endometrial cells that are growing where they shouldn't be. And they've had good success with this so far in tests. The diagnostic piece, it feels like an interesting little bonus piece of this, and kind of a benefit of working with these magnetic nanoparticles, because the magnetic nanoparticles can be used as an MRI contrast agent. Basically means you get an MRA and they show up, right? And so depending on where they're showing up, you can diagnose different disease you could be using. You could be like, oh, well, this patch is showing up somewhere where it shouldn't be on the fallopian tube, so maybe this is endometriosis, things like that. And this is a much less invasive way to diagnose, right? And because that wasn't...
Yeah, exactly. So like with endometriosis, for instance, like the kind of gold standard, the way that they often diagnose this is through surgery. So you'll have to go through a kind of invasive laparoscopic surgery because you can't always see the endometrial lesions and the scar tissue through just regular ultrasound imaging. Sometimes you can, but often you just have to go right to a surgery to really get the diagnosis. So.
Yeah. So, just to kind of describe the way this would work, the step-by-step process, which I think is kind of interesting. So you inject the nanoparticles, right? They're into your bloodstream and they're flowing around. And one of the characteristics of tumors and endometriosis lesions is they grow blood vessels. They have a lot of blood vessels around them, but these aren't normal blood vessels. They're super, super porous blood vessels. And, as the nanoparticles are flowing through your blood system, a certain amount of them kind of leak out through these. And another thing that the cancer cells and the endometrial cells have in common is that they're super hungry, right? They're trying to grow. They really want nutrients. And the lab has designed their nanoparticles to basically kind of look like nutrients, they bamboozle them, the cells, and they have these receptors that work and make the cancer cells, the cells that you don't want, think that they're good, and so that they eat them, they gobble them up.
Oh, tricky.
And so, yeah, right? I know. They're smart people. And so over time, the nanoparticles accumulate in these cells that you don't want in your body. And that's how, they can really target. And so if you then, that's how you can, you put the paddle on and you can heat them up. But also if you give an MRI, basically all those nanoparticles that are concentrated are going to light up like a Christmas tree, right? It's going to be super bright. It's going to be super obvious. Here are the problem cells. And I think that would really kind of be a game changer for endometriosis.
Yeah. The fact that all of this is non-invasive, less invasive method of treatment and diagnosis seems really huge. Brooke, what was it like for you to work on this story given your personal experience with endometriosis?
Yeah, it was great, actually. I mean, like I said, when Jess kind of approached me at OPB and asked if I would work on this with her, I didn't right away tell her oh yeah, I would totally love to, because I also have endometriosis. I was just from a filmmaking and reporting perspective, I was that is fascinating. I cannot believe there are people studying, nanotechnology like this.
I think I learned it in the first meeting we had together. Yeah, I was wow.
I was by the way, I'm, super interested in this, but it was just really wonderful, honestly, to work on this, because I think, something Jess and I talked a lot about was that often when we talk about women's health, or when we talk about, these are really serious issues. We're talking about cancer, we're talking about, a condition which is really painful. But often, when you're talking about women's health, it's either all doom and gloom, or this really flowery kind of thing. So I think what we wanted to focus on in this piece was how hopeful this was. And Jess can attest to this. I did get emotional at one point especially during Ole's interview.
Ole made her cry.
Ole made me cry. I'm sitting there, trying to like make sure the image is in focus and like checking sound, but I'm also like kind of crying a little because I was just sitting there in front of this brilliant scientist who, is studying ways to like make people's lives better, to do like these non-invasive treatments for diseases that women have been talking about for a really long time. And I think just like that recognition that someone is listening, and it's like really brilliant people who are listening. It was just really, really special, and it just felt really hopeful. And so we tried to make the video that, that resulted from this. We tried to make that video like have that same spirit of like, this is kind of fun and fascinating and hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it kind of like having her tell me her experiences. I mean, I haven't experienced endometriosis, and it just kind of drove home for me like, oh, wait, this is actually impacting someone who's like right next to me as we're filming, that they're having this stuff happen. And I just want to drive home, like, the scientists didn't talk about this very much. I couldn't get them to open up about it. The idea that there is a lab out there that is focused they're not only focused on women's health, but that are looking at so many different women's health issues is really rare. And I don't think it's not necessarily because people just aren't interested in it. There's like this legacy of kind of women's health issue being ignored, women's complaints being ignored when they go to the doctors, like, are not believed, right? The whole like hysteria, like that whole thing of the past.
All right. She's just being dramatic.
Yeah, she's just being dramatic. But and I mean, that's come and some of that has followed, but the reality is the amount of money there is for research into women's health issues, even if those diseases like ovarian cancer are incredibly, like the survival rate is incredibly low, there just hasn't been as much money that was available for this. And so, I mean, that's another piece of this. They've managed to put together proposals that they can get funded. And that's such a huge part of research in this country, in this world, right, is getting that funded. And so that as well was kind of amazing to me that we have this lab in Oregon that is doing this work that is so important, and that really, they're breaking new ground, but they're also, the fact that they're focusing on women's health so intensely, I think is just super rare.
Yeah. Ole Teratula is clearly really passionate about his work.
I think I always wanted to help people. And especially when I started to learn about different diseases, I realized how difficult it is, and that many patients, they suffer from that. And I thought it would be really cool just to use nanomaterials for the treatment of those diseases. And basically, it was my motivation.
As I mentioned, Ole's wife, Olena Teratula, is an integral part of the research team, and she's focused on another application for magnetic nanoparticles, treating ectopic pregnancy. That's when a fertilized egg implants outside the uterus, typically in one of the fallopian tubes. Like some of the other health conditions the team is focused on, it is both very dangerous and difficult to diagnose. According to Olena, nanomedicine could make a huge difference for people with this condition.
Because we can stop the ectopic pregnancy faster, and we can avoid, possible surgical intervention, for instance, and save fallopian tube.
Just like with endometriosis or cancer, the ectopic pregnancy cells would be heated up, and this non-invasive treatment would rely on the body to get rid of the dead cells after that.
My goal is to develop an effective nano tool which could be universal.
And Jess, before we wrap up, I just have to talk about this visual aid that you have created. For the people listening to the podcast who can't see it, I'm sorry, but Jess built a giant, magnificent uterus for her video. And when I say giant, I mean it is almost as tall as she is. Jess, how exactly did you construct this thing?
It's basically wood, chicken wire, and paper mache, right? Like there's no magic about that. I mean, it's a big thing. But yeah, Brooke and I, we would talk ahead of the video, starting the video, just being like, all science, no fiction always opens kind of with a very whimsical kind of visual conceit. And we've done Legos, we've done giant light brights, we've done all stop motion, we've done all kinds of things. And so we were just kind of throwing around ideas on the way home from, it might have been this shoot, and just being like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And giant uterus popped up. And as soon as we said that, we were like, yes, that is what's going to happen.
This is the way.
Yeah. So yeah, we built it at combination of at my house, but at OPB. It took days. It was very messy. A lot of people stopped by to say hi. It was really actually a lot of fun.
Including myself.
Yeah.
And you were wearing like an apron, and there was like scissors and like pieces of paper and yarn rolling around. It was like this beautiful, wonderful like arts and craft.
It was
science lab.
A giant, yeah, exactly. And it was all coming together. It was feeling really good. At one point in the construction, it didn't look like a uterus. It looked like a Yoda head. And
it did. It really did.
Someone came by and was like, "Oh, that's Yoderus." And so from there, we call it Yoderus now. That's Joe at OPB. So thanks, Joe.
Shout out
to Joe with the good naming. But it was all coming together, and I was feeling really good about it. And then I started painting, and painting is not my forte. And I started painting, and I was like, oh no, like all of this work, and it's looking so bad. So I called Brooke in, and Brooke has some skills, and so she directed the painting, and so we were both painting in the studio. It was good. It was a lot of fun.
It was definitely very fun. Yeah. And then filming it was another story.
And then she made it look good on camera. It's large. Yeah. And there was a green screen involved, and it was a lot.
There was a lot of playlists.
There were. We listened to a lot of Chapel Roan.
Nice.
That was the vibe for the whole uterus construction and filming thing. So,
oh my gosh, I love that. And I just have to say, everyone at OPB gets so excited when one of these all science, no fiction, visual aids is under construction. It's like the talk of everyone at OPB. So thank you, Jess and Brooke, for building a giant uterus, and thank you both so much for sharing your reporting and for being a part of the Evergreen's very first live event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jess Burns is a science reporter and producer for OPB and the host of the video series All Science, No Fiction. Brooke Herbert is a cinematographer and editor for OPB. You can see the video Jess and Brooke created about the medical applications of magnetic nanoparticles at opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada and Sage Van Wing. Jess Burns, Brooke Herbert, and Dave Miller did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. Thank you so much to OPB Event Marketing Coordinator Alexandra Henrik for helping organize this event, and to the wonderful OPB volunteers lending a hand tonight. Thank you all. Thank you to the staff of the Tomorrow Theater so much. And thank you to the members of the Taratula Lab who are in the audience tonight. If you have a question for us, please reach out. Email theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later. And that's how you do a podcast.